Hello. There we go. You should be able to start your video now, Pat, if you would come up and join me.
It worked.
There we go. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for being patient, because I went through all of that.
Well, I'm the ultimate Luddite, so dealing with technology is not my strong point. So it's amazing that this is all working to me. I love the new technology and all that it can do. I just don't maneuver through it very well.
It's pretty incredible, right? What you can do in technology, and the fact that we can feel so connected in this way. Actually, one of the things I do when I get online with somebody is, before I even get online, I sort of, I'll go in and intend a connection. I'll sort of reach for their energy. And I'll tell you, if you are using this digital service, see what happens if you do that. Just put that intention before you get online with them to actually make a connection with them. Reach out.
My son and I were just before we got started here in his bedroom, and I stared off into space, and he said, "What was that?" And I said, "Oh, I think Asa's just tapping me on the shoulder here."
It's so fun to work with somebody who can feel it. Yes, I get some of those taps. I can often follow them to where they go. I had a friend many years ago who it was back in the day where you paid per minute for a phone call, if it was long distance, and she was self-proclaimed cheap. And so she would never call me. She would, and it used to really piss me off. She would buzz me psychically. She would like do this thing, and she didn't even do it in like a sweet way. It was like a bzzz, like to get my attention. And if I didn't call her within an hour, she was mad. And
there was a famous botanist out here in California named Luther Burbank, and he lived up in Santa Rosa, California. He had an ailing mother for many years, and she used to wire him by telegram, or they would wire him to say, "Mom is sick, you need to come visit." He used to go down to the train station, book himself a ticket to go see his mother, and then he would cross the tracks, go over to the telegram office, and pick up the telegram that was asking him to come. So his mother was reaching out, tapping him on the shoulder before he ever got the telegram, got the message. He'd go get his ticket, ready to go.
So on this sort of psychic experience note, how long have you been having psychic experiences, or what's your earliest memory with it, if I can ask?
Well, as far back as I can remember, many years ago, I was kind of shanghaied by Stanford Research Institute, and we were over there jumping through hoops for them and being tested in a variety of different ways. And of all the people who survived, they kept cutting down the number of people they were working with to the performers, the ones who were getting good results. And everybody who was left in that final group could not remember when it first started. They'd all been that way since they were born. So we had a motto we used to use. We called ourselves, we said, we are natural, not supernatural. And these talents are natural that we have, and we were born with them. So, we actually nicknamed ourselves the Naturals back then in the 70s. And yeah, as far back as I can remember, I had a lot of information running through my head when I was very small, and a lot of it was herbological. I was kind of a walking herbological dictionary. And when we started, as I got a little bit older, I did a little research. Most of the herbs that I was talking about when I was little were European and medieval. They weren't really, they didn't grow on this continent, the different things that I was referring to. And the usages for them were all, many of them, they hadn't been utilized for hundreds of years. But yeah, my brother slammed my finger in the closet door many years ago when I was 6 years old. And I told my mother, we need to get liverwort and cobwebs, liverwort as the anti-infection agent, and cobwebs to stop the bleeding, which is a lovely remedy if you're in the 1300s.
Yeah. Did she ignore that suggestion?
Well, they thought I had invented my own little world that I lived in, and for a little while, when she started finding some of these references were true or valid, that there was such a thing as liverwort, I didn't make it up. Then for a little while, they thought I was a genius, and then I got to school age and began disproving that theory. But but I remember my dad came home back in the late 50s. And he absolutely hit the roof. We were not in very good shape financially when I was growing up. And my mother had spent $100 for a subscription to an encyclopedia that was for children. And what she told my father was, this way, when he says something, meaning me, I can tell the neighbors he read it in his encyclopedia. So my sweet mother was coming up with a cover story for me when I was a kid.
Love your mom. My mother would say when I was a kid, I would tell her certain things, and I always tell the story that she was like, I wasn't sure if he was a genius, mental, or or psychic, but I figured I would keep listening to find out. It was best to have him continue to tell me these things so I could, make sure I could track it and see if he needed help as we went on down the road. So she never told me, as many people had those experiences where they were told it was just their imagination or whatever. My mother would say things like, well, that's really nice, honey. You should keep telling me these stories.
Well, my experience going through grade school, I was kind of a dull kid. I mean, I got to about second grade before I realized that not everybody heard things and knew things and saw things. I thought it was universal. And gosh, I had a very formative experience on the playground, I think about fourth grade, as our class bully, who I still remember his name, but I'm not going to mention him here, called me stupid. And I said, I might be stupid, but you're a bedwetter. And he just beat the tar out of me. He was a little older than I was. And, but I still remember this guy was sitting on my chest, pounding on me on the playground. And he had tears running down his face. And I felt horrible. I felt absolutely evil, that I had pulled something out and used it against him. And so I tried to shut it down for a long time. I actually tried to mimic what looked like normal behavior from the other kids. And that made me look really strange.
The funny thing about this work, it's why a lot of psychics that I've met and that are out there that got information, they tried to shut it down young, and a lot of times it was because they felt the power of their words when they did read something and the impact of that, and it felt like too much. I definitely remember, I couldn't inflict pain without going through pain myself, and especially with information with that was coming through from the unseen. There's no real degree for this work, but there's definitely a criteria of integrity that I think really matters.
I have come to the conclusion that most of us, naturals, tend to shut down at some point and try to mute it or compartmentalize it, do something with it. And I think that it may be a natural part of the process too. I often joke that I don't think I'd have learned to tie my own shoelaces if I hadn't stepped away from that talent for a little while and, focused on the so-called real world and learned some other practical skills. So in terms of navigating, the other thing is that there are very, very few benefits to growing older, but one is that you sort of learn how to use what you've got. And growing up, once I came out of my shutdown period, I first started doing this professionally when I was 19 years old. So I was wide open, crazy, clairvoyant kid. And I was at a book signing years ago, and a woman asked me a question I'd never been asked before. She said, well, are you getting more psychic as the years go by? And I told her, if anything, I was totally wide open, and it was like a kaleidoscope in my head all the time when I was a kid. But I said, so if anything, I'm a little duller now, not quite as wide open, but I am a much, much better reader now, because now when I see something, I can put it in context, or I might have a chance to know what it is. Whereas when I was 19, I'd, have way too much information and have no idea how to put it out there in practical terms for someone.
Yeah, it's definitely been a refinement for me as I've gotten older, I would say, but definitely not more powerful. When I was young, it was, but I also think when I was young, there were times I walked around where, I looked a little disassociated and my eyes were sort of over here sometimes because I didn't know how to stay in the body with it all.
The space cadet period, I call that for myself. Yeah, I was when I was in Berkeley. I was, of course, at Berkeley. I didn't make me at all unusual. There were a lot of space cadets in Berkeley.
Especially what year were you at Berkeley?
74.
So around then it was definitely much more expected. So speaking of 1974, one thing that did come up in our dialogue initially around this is I believe that you had a vision that might relate in some way to what's been going on now. And when I asked you on, I really was curious about, for a variety of reasons, just to say you're a parent, you're a grandparent, you've been around a little while, you've connected with a lot of people. And I just thought it would be interesting to get your perspective as a psychic, as a someone doing this work in the world. But what I didn't expect is to find out that you had a vision that you thought might actually connect right now. So I was wondering if we could talk about that.
Well, years and years ago, since I'm an old guy, I get to say things like, back before you were born, Asa, I had this vision. And back, my teacher always used to tell me, Patrick, visions are liars. He said, just tell people what you see. Don't try to interpret it, because you never know if you're going to get the interpretation right with what you see. You might be led astray. I've ignored him for 47 years. I always try to interpret and very often put my foot in my mouth. But I had a vivid, rather dark, clairvoyant vision of people walking around wearing masks, a worldwide epidemic of respiratory disease, and the sky looked very smoky and hazy. And I was connecting it to the environment. And back then, I had no background in science, and I didn't have the vocabulary to use. We didn't talk about, global climate change in that way, or carbon emissions or anything like that, the degradation of the atmosphere. So in my head, I just always called it the oxygen crisis. And it seemed to be sitting out there about 2030, 2032, when I counted on my fingers to try to measure the time. And it was very disturbing. I at the time, I wasn't terribly alarmed, because to me, that was the far distant future. I mean, that was like Star Trek out there somewhere. And who knew if I'd ever live long enough to see those days. And then over the years, I've been checking in on it, this cataclysm, and it had been marching closer and closer, over the years. I mean, 2030 does not seem that far away now. And at my age, a mere 10 years seems like nothing anymore. It goes by like that. So I'm starting to get more and more worried. One thing about the nature of time and events that are out there in the timeline, especially big global events, is they tend to move around depending on what happens in the present time. The future, actually, as it says on this stone that I have right here, I don't know if you can see it.
Yep, nothing.
Yeah. Nothing is written in stone. I had to do that. So, one of my claims to fame back in the 80s was that I was on some television show, and I boldly declared that in 3 years, the Berlin Wall was going to come down. And then sure enough, 3 years, bingo, right on the money. If I had been really completely honest during that interview, I probably would have said something more along the lines of sometime in the next 1 to 5 years, the Berlin Wall is going to come down, because it was on a bungee cord, it was moving around a little. And I got lucky. It landed right in the middle. So I sort of averaged it out in that interview and said 3 years. When I kept looking at this big environmental cataclysm, it didn't move around a lot. And that is more characteristic of an event that's actually going to happen. It is more likely to occur if it doesn't move around, because there aren't that many variables or things changing in the present time to move it off the timescape. So I was getting a little worried about it. When we had our wildfires out here in the West, the sky turned smoky. People were walking around wearing masks. And I thought, maybe that's it. It's forest fires. It's terrible, but we can handle that. And I thought maybe that's my vision, because it matched the images that I had seen. But when I tried to step way back from it, and as you know, when you're looking at something, you want to avoid your own prejudices and wishful thinking and fears. And I got as neutral and objective as I could. Nope, that environmental cataclysm was still out there. And so the forest fires, that wasn't it. Then along comes this pandemic. And I thought, oh my gosh, maybe it's early. This is even matches better the vision I had, people wearing masks and a global pandemic and people dying from a serious worldwide epidemic of respiratory disease, as that had been part of my vision. And then when I stepped way, way back and looked again, no, I still saw that environmental disaster out there, still out about 2030, and still sitting there waiting for us. But over all these decades, I've been trying to brainstorm, how do we change the political landscape, or how do we develop a massive global will to do something to keep the environment from degrading, to keep the atmosphere from, turning dark and smoky and having another, big epidemic of respiratory disease based on environmental problems. And nothing seemed to work. I mean, we've got, good, noble, amazing, brave people out there working in the environmental movement all around the world, trying to, get us greener and greener as we go forward. But, it doesn't seem to matter. We can elect a genius, we can elect an idiot, and have done, to try to remedy this situation. And it doesn't really seem to matter too much what we do politically. But I think this pandemic might be what helps to create the unification and a massive global will to do all of the hard things that we need to do to avoid this environmental catastrophe down the road. So, in one sense, this is a very, very bad, horrible thing that I think may be preventing a worse thing from happening. So that's been my take on this. And I'm kind of hoping that I'm right about that, so that we can manage to avoid worse problems down the road.
Sounds like the god Ganesha. Are you familiar with Ganesha?
Yes.
He likes to he'll put these obstacles in your path to help you avoid the greater obstacles that are always there over there. People will love to call on Ganesh to say, oh my God, these obstacles, please get rid of all my obstacles. And then they go into suffering and they get confused. And I'm like, no. You never call upon Ganesha unless you are willing to go over hurdles, because that helps you avoid those bigger obstacles.
Well, speaking of India, actually, one thing to explain the nature of time a little bit more, I was wrong about a prediction that I made back in the 70s as well. I had this vision of a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan. And back at the time, we didn't know whether Pakistan had a bomb or not. But it looked like there was going to be like an accidental launch, and then there was going to be a response, and it was going to irradiate parts of the Near East for years to come, and it seemed pretty horrible. And one morning, I woke up back in the 80s, and it had just vanished from the timeline. At that point, it was getting closer and closer. It was probably about a year away in the way that I was viewing it. And it was just gone. There was no sign of it anymore when I went groping out there in time to look for it. And I thought, well, maybe we got, our political act together, and non-proliferation was, we got in the heads of the politicians. Maybe they changed their ways. But actually what had happened was Chernobyl. And in the aftermath of Chernobyl, it changed our consciousness. We realized that radiation didn't respect borders. And we started signing treaties and started knocking down the number of warheads. And we averted a nuclear catastrophe, I believe, that just went right off the timeline. So I wasn't terribly invested in being right about that one. I'm really glad I wasn't.
There's definitely things I hope I'm not right about. I need to go back. I want to make sure before I forget some things that came up there, because you said so much at one time. I have several questions. So one, to start with, are you saying that vision for 2030, as I understood it though, you are saying it's still there at this moment?
Yeah, I'm going to monitor it to see if it moves a little bit more. A little bit more time has to grind forward to create the trend that I would follow out to that point in time. Following the little dancing thread of probability into the future is, if there are so many variables, it gets harder and harder to do the further out you go. When a firm trend is established by what's happening in the present, then you can see a more solid future down the road. It's just one of the things. So the time just keeps changing all the time. But I'm hoping that trend is going to develop. I'm gonna re-examine it month by month. Actually, I've been re-examining it like every 10 minutes just because I'm so nosy and curious. I can't wait. But so far, I haven't seen a huge change. But I'm keeping my fingers crossed there'll be substantial change in that vision.
And can you elaborate at all on like how you look at that? Like how you check in every 10 minutes or so, or when you're doing that? What's your, is there a way to share that, or is that?
Well, the three talents, what the labels that I put on what I do, number one is clairsentience. That's what I use every day, just networking emotionally, feeling other people's emotions, characterizing them, figuring out how they're going to behave based on their emotional makeup, and then extrapolating that out through their networks and other people, and it gives you lots and lots of information. The other is what I call abstract intuition, which is just knowing something without having any earthly way of knowing it, or what one of my teachers used to call knowingness, just pure information. And then clairvoyance is probably the least dependable. It afflicts me every day, but I have no control over when something like that comes in. But once I've had a vision, when I revisit it and I know where it is situated in time and space, I can go revisit it and look and see whether it is changing or mutating or moving further away or getting closer. So the shortest, simplest answer to that question is I don't know how I do it. I close my eyes, concentrate, go revisit what I saw before, follow it forward through time, and see if it's still there.
I actually have to tell you, explaining this stuff is really difficult. I actually think you did an amazing job leading up to that. Very much so, to giving us a little bit of insight in maybe how you work and what you're working with. And the idea, because the thing I really relate to is that idea that you have a vision or you see something and you can return to it to see if it's still there or if it's changed, or how that, even what the feelings are, what the energy is that connects to that. So on this, staying in this sort of same really interesting subject of this vision, so is it your hope that what's happening now is going to help change what's coming, or is there also an intuition? Is there another sort of psychic input you got that sort of leads you to believe that this is going to help us, potentially help us to avoid that greater catastrophe? Like, is that logic working, and people and the world and fear and the power of that, or is this intuition?
Well, I often joke about PIFL, PFFL, the 4 elements that'll interfere with your vision. The P stands for prejudice. Personal prejudices can alter what you're seeing, the way you filter it. The first F is fear, because our fears dictate to us often, or alter or change what we're seeing. And the second F is fantasy, wishful thinking, what you want to be true. And then the big L, you mentioned logic, the big bugaboo of Western minds. We think because something logically should be so, it will be so. And that is just not always the case with human behavior. In this particular situation, I have the same prejudice I think that most of the human race has. I want to keep us going and to keep us healthy and see us survive and go on to an era of peace and prosperity and health for everybody. So when I look at something like this big ecological disaster, I have a vested interest. I have a rooting interest. I'm hoping it will not happen. So I have to watch myself to try not to be too rosy here, just from my own wishful thinking about it. I don't have absolute knowledge that this pandemic is going to be the piece of the puzzle that helps us. I often say I hope that when we go through this test that, as you mentioned, Ganesha, putting the obstacle in your path, I hope we progress rather than regress. When people get scared en masse, they sometimes behave foolishly. And we've been through times like that before. But I'm hoping we step up. I'm seeing great examples, especially a lot of younger people who are finding themselves and taking authority for, a certain type of leadership in the world now, because they're being put to the test and making sacrifices now.
Yeah, I've actually seen a lot of that too. It's been nice to see I think we talked a little about this, but seeing the millennials also stepping up and saying, no. But wait, but I still didn't, in all of that, I just want to make sure. So you're saying that there's been intuition or a psychic sense that this is actually impacting what?
And that is what I believe. And given a little bit more time, I think I will know it. But right. I'm mixing words a little bit here, but yeah.
No, I don't think you are, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I actually have had my own feelings that certain things were coming, and I actually, many psychics that I've talked to have had feelings that certain things were coming, and that it might actually also be helping us with that we were going to go through hard times that were actually leading us to better decisions and better choices for the future. So it's not, I think there's a lot of people that have been feeling that. And I think when things are happening, you have to sort of sit back, because we are human, right? You have a family, you have kids, you want them to have a better world, not a worse world than what we had. And to imagine them not having that is difficult. You have to find ways to put that aside as a psychic to be able to receive the information and tune in. And it's a process. So I don't think you're being anything other than clear that it takes time to find that, right? I always say it's almost, there's times for me where I feel like it's like sitting with something long enough to letting something settle in me, and that, it's not necessarily, I can't take away my judgments or my opinions or my wants, but I can let them settle. And if I can let them settle enough, then I can see more clearly things that I might have attachment to with the outcomes. So I don't know if it ever feels that way, but that's
Well, for me, it has to do with, like I say, sorting out the piffle, just separating out my prejudice, fantasy, fear, logic from the process. And what you have left after you've taken all that out tends to be closer to the truth.
So if this is a part of maybe helping us and maybe the wake up of like, we're going somewhere really bad, which, and I actually said when this first started, I said, I hope when we get to the other side of this, I hope it starts a conversation that if people think it's suffering to have to stay home with plenty of food in the grocery stores and plenty of water, clean water and well, that's relative, by the way, but plenty of water and all of that. Just wait. I hope it starts this conversation on what's going to happen when we've destroyed the environment so much that we have food rations and water rations and we can't leave our homes and our government's having to take control because of the state of the world. And so there is a bigger conversation that needs to happen here. But one of the things I've seen that I think is so amazing is what nature is showing us right now. What we're seeing with, are you familiar with what's been happening in the oceans with the whales?
Well, I've been hearing about dolphins in the canals in Venice.
Yeah, that as well. But also they were, so I guess those who listen for seismic activity have been hearing near the oceans, have been hearing all these songs, all this music in the water, and they got the oceanographers involved. And it turns out that the whales are singing in ways that we haven't ever heard since we've had the ability to listen to them. And part of it, they believe, is the lack of movement, the ships out there. And so the ocean is singing in a way that it never has. And we are out there, these oceanographers, and they are doing everything they can to record as much of it as they possibly can before we start back up again. And
Well,
so
I imagine the whales are telling each other, hey, this traffic is so much better than it has been.
yes. Well, and there's been I think I heard about the octopuses coming out. There was something like, I wish I had the article right in front of me. I think it was like 70,000 sea turtles that went up on the beaches and were laying their eggs on the beaches because people weren't there. What else has happened? The air in LA, the earth is showing us, what an impact we've have on it, and I think it's speaking really loudly considering what's happening and how fast it's taking place.
Yeah, when I heard that they could see the Himalayas from New Delhi, I was astonished. That has not been possible for decades.
Yeah, so decades of not being able to do it in a couple of months of us not polluting the way we've been, and look at what happened. So, I wonder if this is also a part of the conversation, that's gonna, besides just living with less, and I hear people talking about this a lot, it's like, wow, I don't need as much as I did, it's some people.
Well, and the idea of what we can do when we have to do it. A lot of people are talking about all these trillions now being pulled out and utilized by government with this pandemic, and that it could very well, they were complaining before they didn't have enough money to pay for healthcare, but obviously when we have to do something and are motivated, we can do it. And cleaning up the environment. I used to ride my bicycle out across the countryside and went up to Pacheco Pass here in California and looked across the Central Valley to the Sierras. When I was a kid, they were crystal clear, on a spring day. And it's been many decades since you could look across the valley and see the snow-capped Sierra. That's become true now that the air is cleared up enough and the first thought I had when I saw that haze as the years went by was, there are little children living down in that valley, breathing that every day. We've had scientists around the world taking air samples. There's a fellow up at Donner Lake in the high Sierras in California who's getting particulate matter in his air traps that comes from Shanghai. So we've gone beyond mere smog. We have GLOG now, global smog, and it's traversing the oceans, which used to be a big washing machine and clean it out, but not anymore. So, to have this moment of clarity, literally, where we have clean air to breathe, I think tells us what we can do if we develop the will to do so, and a desire for our children to keep breathing free.
On that note, how old are your kids?
They range. I mean, I've got a 43-year-old, a 40-year-old. I've got grandchildren now, 9 and 6, and they're.
I'm interested in the grandchildren. How are they responding to this? Did they know much about it? Did they realize what's happening?
They're of course restless, but I think they're delighted to have their parents at home and have them at their beck and call as well. They're rambunctious. They're playing a Minecraft game on online and enjoying that a lot. And we walk over to their house and wave from the street. And we played long distance Simon Says the other day and made them a little chalk obstacle course on the sidewalk. They seem in pretty good spirits. I know that children absorb and interpret, the worries and anxieties of their parents as well. So it's always good for the parents to frame things for the young children, to let them realize, that all will be well and that the grown-ups will handle it. Now, for gosh sakes, let's hope the grown-ups handle it. But it's they absorb a lot, and we have to make sure they're not misinterpreting it or we're not allowing their fears to build up in their own minds when they just pick it up, that worried vibe from mom and dad. But yeah, my kids are doing a great job of doing that. A lot of this is the youngsters, Delphine and Atlas, my grandchildren, are just shrugging it right off.
It's great. It's good that they've been able to do it. They're fortunate. I don't know that that's happening everywhere or can happen everywhere. So I'm curious, with where we are, what about any psychic hits or information we can give people now as far as with what's going on with COVID? Have you had any impressions about it? Anything from how long you think it may go on, anything that you might have had?
Well, my strength is reading people and their emotional reactions. So I look at what I call a comfort level, which tells me how comfortable and secure people feel over time. In fact, that was what I was looking at when the first glimmer I got of this pandemic was I saw the stock market crashing. And then, I did not see this coming as a virus at all. I spent about a month asking myself, well, what could it possibly be that's coming that's going to make people so scared? I mean, why are they all? I didn't, I'd been looking at a market drop for a long time, but it was just because I thought the balloon was getting blown up too big and it was going to pop, economically. But when I follow along people en masse, looking at the population as a whole and how people are reacting to it, we're past the point where we've been investing in it strongly with fear. And that tends to be true of almost any big emotional investment that people make nationally as a nation or even globally. We tend to invest for about 90 days, and then we figure out a way to cope with it, reconcile it, compartmentalize it, or just get on with our life. It becomes a new normal for us. And we've just passed the point last week or so where that a little bit of calming down happened. Around June 1st, we look like we're interacting more and interacting with each other more, and people are getting a little calmer. We're not out of the woods for a long time with this thing, unfortunately. By September, we look like we're gaining a little more momentum. Within the next year, to give you a completely imaginary statistic, but I'm guesstimating, we get back, in terms of commerce and business and interaction to about 75% of where we were before this thing struck. And that's kind of levels off and continues for a couple of years. We're not really getting up to hurtling forward with the speed we were before.
So wait, 75% is about a year from now, you're saying?
Yeah.
That's really
and I think we've got about a 3-year trip to pull out of the economic doldrums and get most people feeling a little better about how they're doing.
Really interesting. Patty had last week said, astrologically looking at it, that we would recover to a certain point by March of next year, but that we would still have an economic thing that would be going on for.
We're getting a big bump up just a little bit shy of a year from now, which I think is either a therapeutic or a vaccine. I'm just logically assuming that must be the case. Why everybody's heaving a big sigh of relief, at that point. I hate like heck to agree with experts, but that seems to be what the experts are telling us as well.
Yeah. How do you feel about vaccines? Have you heard some of these conspiracy theories right now going on around this specific COVID-19?
Yeah, I have used antibiotics in the past, and they are very good at knocking down bacteria. And like anything else, they can be overused or misused. and I get a flu vaccination. And when my grandchildren were born, I got a whooping cough or a pertussis vaccination because I didn't want to be responsible for passing something dangerous along to my kid. I think there's a fine line to walk. I know a lot of people are very suspicious of vaccines and like to keep any kind of medical intervention to a minimum. And Lord knows, I mean, I've had doctors tell me many times over the years that I was going to die. And they were wrong. I mean, I was told more than 40 years ago that I had 3 years to live. So go figure. But
what were you, tell us what you were diagnosed with at that moment that they said 3 years?
They thought I had ALS, Lou Gehrig's, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It took me 3 years to learn to pronounce it. I couldn't die. I had to learn how to pronounce the darn thing. But yeah, I went through a long process of investigating that and diagnosing it and trying to heal it, and then I'm still here. So either it was misdiagnosed or I managed to effect a healing. But it gives me a little bit different perspective on. I never accept absolutely something that I'm told by a medical professional, but I do sort it out in my own head in terms of what I think is an acceptable risk. And I do believe that vaccinating kids is a good idea for the vast majority of people, and it's good for all of us to have our kids protected against the things that we used to have. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when my brother got the measles, they put one of those green pasted quarantine posters on our door. And that used to happen. The dreaded quarantine sign would get put up on your house and you were not allowed to go out. We had whooping cough, we had diphtheria, we had polio. In my early days, my mother was afraid I was going to get polio. We weren't allowed to go to the public swimming pool. And it was a realistic fear. It was pretty communicable, and the consequences of getting polio were pretty severe. So, yeah, I have to say that while I sympathize with people who are suspicious of government medical programs and medical intervention, that I believe in vaccinating.
Well, and that's good to know too. But also outside of like the general conversation of vaccines, one of the things that again that they've been talking, there's been a lot of talk around, and I hear the community with respects to COVID-19 is, it really deals with Bill Gates and having done, I don't know if you heard about this, but he had done a TED Talk either last year or the year before, and talking about this coronavirus being, the future pandemic was coming, and this was one of the biggest dangers coming on. He's the largest donator to, the World Health Organization. He is, the largest shareholder in the company that's trying to make the vaccine for this. And the thing that I've been hearing now from certain corners is that they're going to actually put technology in these vaccines now and track us. And, there's this whole big conspiracy that's unraveling. And so here's my question, taking all of that in note. Have you reached out and as a psychic and read to see not if that is true or not true? That's not really, I don't think it's not an interesting conversation in the sense that we don't know, right? There's so many ways you can look at all these things. But what I am interested in, I think, is something you can read as a psychic. Have you looked at and used your abilities in any way to see how much, because there's obviously manipulation that happens all the time in, there's the opportunist in every situation, no matter how bad or how good. So that aside, how much conspiracy or how much manipulation is going on right now in the world around? Have you in any way peered that way, or is that just not a way that you necessarily look?
Well, in terms of direct government intervention to, inject mini bots into us with vaccines, I don't know that we have accomplished that technology yet. And I never saw anything like that in terms of any future vision I had, as terrible as some of the visions I've had. I used to tease other psychics who came up with, apocalyptic visions, the end of the world in 2012, or the Y2K virus, or the at the end of the millennium, year 2000, we were all supposed to get carried off, or the comet was coming and going to get us all, or the great tidal wave of New York in 1981. Edgar Cayce came up with that one. And I used to sort of joke about it until I became one of those people predicting this big ecological disaster. So now I'm a little more sympathetic. But many, many years ago, I remember I was reading certain people down in Santa Barbara, and some of them were connected to politics. And I realized that something that there was a conspiracy theory saying that, oh gosh, we were trading arms for hostages with the Contras in Central America, and this complicated conspiracy theory. And my first thought was, nah, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. I was very skeptical of the people who were bringing it forward. And then when I encountered or crossed paths with some of the people involved in that particular situation, I was dumbfounded. I thought, oh my gosh, it's true. Uh, so I'll have a willing suspension of disbelief about some of the conspiracy theories. For me, even I don't have any real technological or scientific background, so I don't know the basis for some of these things. I do know that, what concerns me more than Bill Gates being motivated to, infect us all with something that can control us or monitor us. I worry more about information technology being hijacked, our elections being hijacked, bad actors around the world deciding that they're going to change the information stream and tell us things that are not true, and tell us so often and so thoroughly that we start to believe they're true. And so I think a certain amount of skepticism about almost all information is worthwhile. But yeah, I haven't really had that on my radar that Bill Gates is going to turn us into robots or anything.
And then what about Wi-Fi and 5G and this stuff? How do you does it disrupt you at all? Do you find that it impacts you at all? I mean,
I looked into this because several of my clients had mentioned, is could it be the 5G with a connection to Wuhan and connection to Italy? And the thing is, 5G has been installed elsewhere and hasn't seemed to have the same effect, or the effect that it's supposed to be having. It's also difficult to understand exactly how a virus such as this is connected to something that has more to do with telecommunications and the wavelengths that are flying through the air invisibly all around us, to create an epidemic. So I'm not sure I believe that one. I haven't got enough evidence that I have seen personally to be able to give me a handle on that.
Well, actually, my real question though is, in general,
and I'm paranoid as can be. Let me tell you, like most psychics.
It is funny. It's true. Psychics often have their edge there.
Well, we developed this in self-defense mode when we're growing up. I always tell people, if you want a good synonym for psychic, try horrendously overly sensitive.
So what I'm really wondering is, with 5G or with Wi-Fi and all that stuff, is do you find yourself in any way sensitive to it as a psychic, as an intuitive? Like, what's your relationship to that?
Well, back before we had good modern microwave ovens, they always used to affect me when somebody turned on the microwave, back when they were leaky. And so somebody would turn on a microphone or a microwave, and I'd get the shivers. And microwave towers and that kind of radiation, even when I'm driving, sometimes I'll feel it, and I will dissociate slightly when I'm around it. Different kinds of wavelength and energy do affect me a little bit more. But so, I know that those energies are there. I wouldn't want to live underneath a transmission tower or around high tension lines, things like that, or be bathed in that all the time. But yeah, I have a sensitivity to it, but I haven't attributed any physical effects. I think the chemical environment we're bathed in creates really more problems for us in terms of pollution and degradation of the water and the air, because it's almost impossible to avoid micro doses of different harmful things in our food and in our, and all the food that comes out of the sea now is to some extent affected by what we've been dumping into rivers. So those kinds of things, yeah, I will acknowledge, and we should try to eat and drink as cleanly as we can.
Well, the only thing I will say is, as a New Yorker, and as many people who are on here are New Yorkers, we are bathed in this so often. I mean, in the time I had lived in my apartment in the last year, I went from not seeing any cell towers outside my windows to having 3 different 5G towers coming in. And I think, what my concern is, not that you have to have the answer for this, but just to bring it up, my concern is that I do feel it. If especially back in the day with the microwaves and the first cell phones. Oh my God! First time I ever put a cell phone in my head, I literally, I thought I was gonna have to go to the hospital. It was shocking what happened in my head. And I remember thinking, oh, I'll never have one of these, you know. Of course, I love my iPhone. But it was really just so toxic for me. And so what I think and is, you know, whether it's causing the virus or not, you know, I do wonder about its impact on our immune system, you know, the degradation of our cells and our DNA. And the thing is, they're irradiating everything. You know, most of our meats are irradiated. You know, people don't really know that, but most of our, you know, so much of our food is irradiated. It's really a sin. And so that's where I wonder about it having an impact in our ability to, as far as for causing the virus or not, I think that's another one that's a hard one to answer. I do think there's pretty good information, though, that says that there was laboratories in Wuhan that we knew about. The Wall Street Journal put out a great article about messages that have been sent from the American embassy over there back to Washington a couple of years ago. I think it was in January of 2018 is where it started, saying like, there's a problem. We have these laboratories working with this, you know, this coronavirus in bats and studying it, and they don't have proper protocols in place. So I think most likely it leaked that way. Whether that was,
and you know, when you screw up like that, I mean, then the cover up begins because they're embarrassed. You know, so I don't know whether there's a more sinister motive in restricting the information around it, or whether it's just that they shot themselves in the foot and they you know, don't want people looking into it. But yeah, you know, I mean, as far as 5G goes, you know, I mean, in 1347. The population of the Earth decreased for the first time in recorded history because of the Great Plague that came across through Asia and out into through Europe. And I don't know whether anybody's theorizing that was caused by microwave towers or 5G radiation or not, but I think it predates the cell phone by quite a bit.
Do they have any idea why?
I'm going with bacteria and rats and people starting to travel between East and West more. You know, kind of a mundane explanation for it. I do have something interesting, though. Let me see if I... This is, you know, you know my hobbies, right? You know, this comes from the Domesday Book, which is 1347. And I made a little copy of it. I like to illuminate from time to time. And it's basically Domine mitere digneri sanctum angelum tuum decaelis qui foviat proteget visitet atque defendat hoc omnes habitantes in hoc habitaculo, which means, Lord, promise to send your holy angel from heaven to guard, cherish, visit, and defend all the inhabitants gathered in this house. And it was something that was used as an invocation against the plague. And they would put it up in their houses and hope for the angels to protect them from the bug. So I think it's rather an apropos prayer. No, you don't have to say it in Latin.
For sure. You know what? I think we got a lot of questions with you, so I'm going to turn it over to that in a minute. And but I just wanted to know, you know, is there anything else that you wanted to say, you know, for people who are listening and, you know, going through this right now, or anything else that you wanted to share? Don't feel comfortable, you know.
Well, no, you know, the main thing is in the world to come, we might find that we're going through hard times again, you know, just from the degradation of the environment. And so doing everything that we can do in our own power to do something about it, you know, just living in as responsible a manner as we can. We're already learning a little bit about what we can do without. And so I don't know that we need to go back to galloping materialism. Living a little bit more simply, enjoying nature more, I think we're really going to appreciate nature when we get the opportunity to get back to it. So I think that's all I would really encourage people to do, is to just try to live a little bit more simply and be a little nicer to Mother Earth.
Actually, I do have another question though. So if this is helping to change things, this 2030 prediction, do you think that it has a lot to do with the individuals, or do you think it has more to do with companies or politicians? Like, where do you think that sits as far as the influence that's coming in?
You know, I have a lot of corporate clients, and when I talk to people who are doing hiring or firing or working within one business or another, I always tell them the same thing. They say, well, you know, should I invest in X company or that company? And I'll say, well, it's a collection of people. You know, that's what a company is, a bunch of individuals. So I think that you have to make an individual choice to do the right thing and model it for the people around you and throw your little pebble in the pond and let the ripples go out from that. You know, if you realized how many people you've touched in your lifetime, we're starting to realize it more because we can't touch them. But, you know, if you bring a little positive energy to somebody in your life and that person goes forward and carries a little bit of that forward to everybody else they know, pretty soon you've touched every other human on the face of the earth. You know, so maybe some of the monks sitting up on mountaintops aren't getting it, but you have an influence whether you realize it or not. So bringing the right energy and approach, and you know, I mean, I even with all of this talk of doom and gloom and these prophecies and these visions that I have, I'm an optimist. I have the feeling that we're going to be able to turn the corner anyway. I've always had an abiding belief that humans are going to survive. We're going to carry on, and we're going to, you know, hopefully get into a new golden era. But we have to be responsible about taking these obstacles out of our path, doing something to make it possible to get there. And so we just have to stop fouling our own nest. And individuals can do that. I mean, you know, recycle, drive a hybrid, you know, donate money to Greta Thunberg.
Well, and make choices, and that even the difficult choices that actually express and demonstrate your value, what you care about, and what you want with the world. I was talking in I don't remember where I said this. It was one of my interviews or talks or something, but I was talking about one of my teachers who I study with, and she says, you know, what do you vote for? Like, realize your actions, your choices, and the things you do. That's your vote in the, you know. So what would you vote for? And so I think that our vote is very powerful, and it impacts, you know, peer influence is huge. You know, whether we, you know, I mean, how can we not realize it, right? I mean, you go into corporate America and it's like going into high school. So as far as the relationships and the cliques and the, you know.
Well, educators talk about something called values clarification. And I always find it a good idea for people to update their values, to take a look seriously at what they believe and stand for and stand against, and what you will allow in your presence, what you will not allow in your presence, no matter what, you know. And it does put you into a position of making hard choices sometimes. And you have to make sacrifices if you stay true to your values. But if you know what they are and you sort of rehearse them, it helps you act and interact in the world in a way that provides a model for other people if it's something positive. And it also lets you sleep at night. You know, I mean, if I run into somebody, I don't know, whacking their 2-year-old in the produce section, I have to say something, because one of my values is that big people aren't allowed to hurt little people. And if I stopped to think about that, if I didn't have that value really clarified and rehearsed and strong, I'd stand there like a deer in the headlights saying, okay, should I say something? Should I do anything? If I step in and interfere, is she going to get upset? Is she going to make a scene? Will she lay off the kid now, but clobber him in the parking lot? Will she call the manager? Will she whack me? You know, I mean, what's going to, you know, if I think too much, I'm frozen. If I know what I believe and stand for, and I've clarified that, I understand it in my own mind, then I know that I win, lose, or draw, regardless of result, I have to make a stand there and say something, do something about it. And that lets you sleep at night.
I love this. Values clarified. Fantastic. And I think, you know, lastly on this, you know, sometimes I think we can't always, you know, stand up for our values in a moment. You know, sometimes people are, you know, my mother had 5 children and 4 jobs and was doing what she could, and maybe couldn't have quit a job in that moment. But I do think we can keep by clarifying our values, we can set our sails towards those better, you know, better choices in the future. You know, so even if we can't in that moment, I think one of the things that happens is we get discouraged. I think a lot of people, when they do touch their values and realize maybe in certain areas they're not there, they give up or feel like, oh, I have to shift that value. And I think it's really powerful. We can hold on to that and say, wait a second, you know, maybe I can't do anything about this now, but how can I actually change that in my life at some point?
Well, there's a lot that I tell people, just aim for that. You know, I know with psychics and other hypersensitives, I always tell them, you know, number 1 rule, don't ever take anything personally. And then I always laugh and say, of course, that's impossible for a sensitive person, but aim for that.
Yes. Yep. All right. Well, I want to let Lizette know that I'm definitely open to some questions coming up in here. So if you have any questions that either you.
Yes. Yes, yes. I think we actually have someone that we're going to promote to video, which is exciting.
I think this is the first, so let's see how this.
Yes. All right. So Maura, I'm gonna promote you to video. Just give us 1 second.
Technology.
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna promote her.
They should have a quick, easy button and just be like, boom. I'll write that.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hold on 1 second.
Oh,
Okay.
hi, bye. There we go.
All right. I got her now. Okay.
Hi. I'm Maura. I had a question that I think you answered, because you were talking about the bungee cord and the Berlin Wall, and then this, and so I think you answered that one. But I almost feel like we've changed the meaning of social, and you know, social used to be gathering with friends, and we've turned it into you know, all of this texting and how we present ourselves to other people. And it's not about how we're actually interacting with one another. It's almost anonymous. And I almost feel like this is like a twilight zone. It's a punishment, you know, in terms of, this is, you want to know what social is, and now actually people are going back to calling on the phone and writing letters. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, you see, we old people were right. You know, this is the way to do it. I like that we're modifying the culture a little bit away from the purely technological. One thing, we have studies now that have shown that, you know, under 40 people tend to have less empathy than people over 40. And one of the reasons for that is that they're interacting through their devices so much, and that young people had become a little more cruel towards each other, less empathetic, because they didn't see a face-to-face reaction all the time. If they said something insulting or harsh, they didn't see the other person's face fall or get their feelings hurt in person, so that they got a little more inured to being harsher. And so I think that, you know, we're all forced to be in the same room. And it's, you know, I think it's good for us. I think that we will kind of absorb and work with and get through the technology over time. You know, they talk a lot about youngsters now with something they call nature deficit disorder, that children are on their devices all the time and they're not developing the relationship to nature that they should have. And it's an unhealthy thing for them. And I agree with that wholeheartedly, that children should interact with nature. But I think that we'll find a way to keep our devices and cell phones in communication with each other, and communicating around the opposite side of the world is a thing, brings us closer together, and still be able to make the connections with nature and have a social interaction in person at the same time. I think we will gradually adapt past those problems. Those are steps in the process, I think, of getting a little more enlightened about how we use our technology.
Although 5G brings everything to the forefront, where anything you want, it's known and it's presented to you. You don't have to search for things anymore. I mean, we're solving all of our problems, but creating new ones.
Well, you know, I love the old song, you know, this modern world we're living in gives cause for apprehension with speed and new invention and words like fourth dimension, you know, fifth dimension. You get a little trifle worried, you know, or I get a trifle weary of Mr. Einstein's theory, so he must relax, you know, relieve the tension. That's, of course, you must remember this, a kiss is just a kiss. You know that song from Casablanca? Yeah, that was the preface to it. They were so overwhelmed by the speed and pace of massive technology in 1939. And, you know, I think we can adapt even beyond 5G to just make it part of what we, you know, we bring into our repertoire and utilize and try to keep it in balance. You know, I mean, my mother back in the 50s was, you know, didn't let us watch too much television. We got to watch TV, but it wasn't a constant diet, you know. And so we can work with our children in terms of being able to use the technology in positive ways and still force the little buggers to go out and play in the sunshine once in a while. I think we'll manage to work our way through technological advances that are, you know, overwhelming and intimidating, you know, every time we pick up the pace again. But yeah, I hope we are able to get back to a more natural way of being in the world. The value of nature, I think, can't be underestimated.
Yeah. Thank you, Laura, by the way, for your question. Pat, I actually know you you spend time out in nature. I understand you go off into the woods and you go hang out in Yosemite for pretty long periods of time. Nope. Yourself, is that correct? Do I?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I flee is what I do. Yeah, if I did not take time alone in natural surroundings on a regular basis, I wouldn't be able to keep working.
Yeah, I remembered that. You know what, Lizette, you can find us another question, but I'm going to ask two that I see here while I'm doing this. So if there's somebody else that wants to get promoted up or that you want to see about doing that, go for it.
Yes, we have one more to promote, but I'll let you go.
Hold them for 1 sec here.
Okay.
So here's a question that came up, Pat. Somebody asked, is the virus man-made? Do you have any psychic sense whether you think this is man-made or not?
The short answer is I don't know. I'm going to have to wait and watch and like everybody else to see, what shakes out. I do think that the pandemic was man-made in the sense of the way it was handled and dealt with in the immediate aftermath. So whether it was something that leapt from bats or other, creatures to humans, and then, managed to transmit from human to human and happen in a, essentially natural way, or whether this is something that was lab created, I think we just have to wait and see. There's a lot of, the rumor mill is working overtime on both sides of that question. I haven't seen or felt anything distinct to tell me one way or the other. And reading a virus is not something I've had a lot of experience with.
Right. And then the other question I thought was just might be an easy one for you to just share. So I think I may have mentioned to some people who are coming on here that, one of the ways you read is you'll look at the aura and the bands in the aura. And somebody specifically asked, can you see if somebody's sick by looking at their aura? And what exactly changes? Color, vibrancy? Does it appear cracked or weak, or what would you share?
Well, it's a question of degree. When there's a layer right next to the skin that I call pilot light blue. Looks like the blue you see under a pilot light or a candle flame. And it just helps you to shrug off outside shock or strong emotional energy, anything coming in too fast. If that's gone, then it's relevant and you're likely to be ill. Yeah. Most people, thank goodness, have it. And, occasionally I'll step across a restaurant and tell somebody, have you been to the doctor lately?
You actually done that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the one that's the toughest. Every once in a while I'll see somebody who kind of has an energy signature for something like leukemia, and then I have a moral decision to make. The first question I ask myself is, okay, try.
Oh no!
My big mouth and ruin somebody's day. Yeah.
It's a tough decision what to do in that particular case.
Yeah, less is more in terms of intervention by psychics I've found over the years, but.
All right, so we're gonna take another question here. Lizette promoted up. Hi. Good. We gotta unmute you.
Oh, hold on.
There you are. You're unmuted.
There
You're all
you
good.
go.
So good to see you, Asa.
No, it's been a long time.
I know. Hi, Pat. Nice to meet you. Okay, so my husband and I have been talking about sort of what relationships will look like post the pandemic. For me, of course, I'm dying to see my family. So we feel like we'll all be much closer and nicer to our inner circles. But we wonder about those that are from our outer circles, so strangers. So when I go on a run, for example, I feel like people will likely jump into traffic before just to get out of my way or not be even close to me. So I was curious what your thoughts are in terms of our relationships within our inner circles, but also those that are complete strangers.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm what they call in psychology a fast bonder, which means I feel like I can become old friends with just about anybody in 5 minutes. And I love to chat up strangers out in public, and increasingly over the years, I've noticed already, just because of the technology or somebody's on their cell phones or has their earphones in, that, this crazy old man who wants to strike up a conversation about the weather, there must be something wrong with him. And so we're getting a little further distanced, I think, in that way already. This is going to exacerbate it for darn sure. I'm hoping that we come out of this with a couple of new superpowers. One is what I call basically just the superpower of gratitude, that we are alive and that we all have shared something, and we can have a kind of a fellow feeling as a people, that we've all gone through these hard times together and come out the other side, and appreciate each other a little bit more on that basis. In terms of direct interaction, it's going to take a long time to develop those social reflexes again, where you'll get close to somebody. I speak Spanish, and I have a lot of Latin American friends. And one aspect of life in Latin America has always been that people get a lot closer to you when they talk to you. Well, you're Italian, I say, right?
I'm from Puerto Rico, so I also speak Spanish too.
Entonces, puertorriquenses, they, when they're talking to you, they get right up close to you and make sure you hear them. And, there's that a lot of times when people come north and they encounter just the natural sense of distance or space that Norte Americanos have, it's a little bit of a shock for them at first. Why are you being so cold? Why are you so unfriendly? And it's just one of those social habits. I do think we're going to be distancing ourselves for a long time yet to come. And there's kind of fears that can turn into phobias that come from something like this. There were mothers who would not let their kids swim in a public swimming pool back in the 50s and 60s for a long time because of the memory of polio, long after we had a vaccination. And there will be mothers who will not let their children go play soccer because of the memory of this pandemic for years yet to come. So it's, and I'm not blaming mothers. Mothers are, they're always, that's first and foremost is the safety of their children. But yeah, I'm hoping that we're going to develop a little more fellow feeling and appreciation for our fellow man as having all gone through these hard times together, and unify a little bit more across racial lines and gender lines and national lines and age lines. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how close we're going to be socially in the years to come. I think that we will gradually drift back towards, a more huggable culture, but we'll see.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kylie. And so, listening to you answer that, it brought up a question in my mind, which is, do you think what's going on in this period of social distancing, but also being so much more aware of our interconnectedness on the planet because of what's happening with this virus, do you think that it may impact people's psychic awareness, that it could actually elevate that?
Wow, I'm going to have to look at that right now, because that question made me very curious about the same thing.
I think I'm gonna let you do that. Looked like you went in to do that to go look.
I'm not sure that it will. I like the idea of considering ourselves to be one, on this planet, one with all other beings. And I like the awareness of that growing. Whether people will become more or less sensitive is hard to say. Years ago, Michael Murphy and I were having a conversation. He believed that humans were evolving to become more psychic. And I was countering that, saying, if anything, humans in millennia past actually were more open to this, more psychic than they are now. And so that, and I'm not sure that being hypersensitive is a survival trait, to tell you the truth. Again, that kind of sensitivity can, it's always triggering your fight flight response all the time when you pick things up coming from the environment. So yeah, I'm going to have to go with I don't know on that one. And I'm not sure I'd want to live in a world where everybody was as hypersensitive as I am. It's
sensitivity. I do wonder if it's going to make us, when we communicate, maybe more aware of the energy behind things, right? Like, I know things that you and I might take for granted. I think others may become more sensitive with. My hit has definitely been that our empathic nature is going to grow a lot. Because we're going to be expressing empathy from a distance and in a different way. And so it's not going to sit in our body the same way. And I think it's going to expand our empathic nature, which is why I've been doing these talks and classes on it recently, and wanting to get good information out there about what it means to be an empath and to have that sensitivity, because I don't think it's a curse or just, all about soaking up other people's stuff and suffering and not being out in the world because of it.
Well, I've often told people about things like clairsentience. I say, you do have this, and I swear to God, it's a gift. It is.
Yes. Thank you so much for tonight. As we close out here, can you just, I had some requests in here. Can you just share that timeline one more time as far as now into next year? That would be great.
Well, like I say, we're past what I call the hysteria peak, where we were really at a peak of fear. We're dropping down. June 1st is when I'm targeting for where we're starting to interact more without as much fear and tiptoeing back into a little bit more normal activity. And then we're getting a little more momentum established in the fall, September, October. I do believe, and I hope I'm wrong, that we're going to have a little resurgence of the disease again. And then we are just about a little bit shy of a year from now, spring of the following year, before we get to where everybody just sort of calms down en masse all at once, which tells me we're getting therapeutics or we're getting a vaccine at some point down the road. So that would be the timetable. And then in terms of general, economic recovery and, feeling as prosperous as we were before, I think we're getting back to about 3/4 of that over the course of the next 2-3 years.
And do you think that we'll come back to a similar type economy that we're in now, or do you think it's going to potentially be a whole different economic system?
I don't know that we're going to throw out the infrastructure of the economy. I do think that certain industries are going to vanish. Of course, we've seen in the last decade or so industries pop up that we had no idea were going to be created. Information technology and all the digital world and the cloud that we operate in. But yeah, certain things. I mean, I find it very, very hard to imagine that people are going to be eager to go on cruises in the future.
Sure, there's going to be some challenges there for sure. It will be interesting to see. I hope you are right about this vision with 2030, and that what's happening now changes that, not just for your vision, but also like whether that was ever true or not, for where the world has been heading with nature and with the environment. So
knowing the nature of time, I have to say that I cannot imagine that this massive event would not change the timeline one way or another. I'm just still waiting to let it grind forward just a little bit more before I can really get out there and revisit that vision with any real certainty.
I 100% agree with you.
I'll get back to you, Asa, and let everybody know as soon as I see that.
Thank you so much for being here, for taking the time to do this with me, Pat. I so appreciate it. By the way, I forgot to tell you guys, if you want to find him, it's so easy. It's psychicpat.com. Psychicpat.com. He's amazing at what he does. And catch me Friday night with Dr. Kukai and Walter Blick. I think that's going to be another interesting night. Hanging with these guys. We're going to hear some stuff that maybe we haven't heard before. So, Pat, it was amazing. It was great. And you should do more of this. People need to hear your voice. I think that you have great...
It's special dispensation. I'm doing it for you, Asa. So it's been my honor and privilege.
I think you have such a great way of putting information out there, and it's so accessible and yet touches this unseen world, and I appreciate it very much.
Well, I appreciate you as well, my friend. Take care.
Take care. Have a great night. Thanks, everybody, for being here.